Mansfield, today on a Thursday, and that's when we kick back and go traveling. This this gentleman has a pretty checkered background. I'm talking about Chris Murray. Chris, you are like me, an old Rhodian. But hell, you've worked. I suppose it happens to us when we go into this thing called media. You work all over the place. Where did you start?
Very shortly after finishing at Rhodes, I joined the Pretoria News when it was in its heyday. And for a very short time, I was the first television editor until I got fired from that job for misdemeanors, and then moved to magistrates' courts, where I learnt my licks. And then I shortly after that joined the Rand Daily Mail for a long time, for about 5 years. And went overseas for a couple of years to do the young man's travels, traveled through the States in a van, and then came back and got into the magazine world, where I began with a magazine called Style. I worked for Style for a very short time, and then I got the job that gave me the most fun, and that was with the late and lamented Scope magazine, working for an excellent editor called Dave Mullaney, who was a hell of a lot of fun and a very generous soul, and actually quite brilliant, and had many, many good adventures. And then finally, I guess it was money drove me into the seat of a magazine editor, a magazine called Living Africa, which I ran for about 8 years. And then I met my gorgeous wife, Julian, and we went freelance in 1998. And stayed in Joburg for a short, I guess about 8 years or so, and developed a love for covering the rural areas, working for a magazine called Country Life as freelancers. And then we took ourselves off to the Karoo in 2007. It was a very strange arrival in the Karoo. But, in the first week of arriving in this home in Cradock in the Eastern Cape, Karoo, Great Fish River flows through it. We were settling in with our hundreds and hundreds of boxes from Pickfords, and I suddenly got a call to go to Timbuktu. So I left Jules here with all these boxes and flew up to Mali. Did a gig up there and came back, and then we were just about to have a welcome party across the road of people welcoming us to town when we got the news that our dear friend David Rattray had been murdered. So that put a bit of a dampener on life in the universe. But then we settled in. We settled into Karoo life, and here we are, 15 years later.
Why particularly the Karoo, Chris? What was the attraction there?
Well, being a freelancer, you would understand that you don't really go where everybody else has gone. You try and find your own niche that you work. You use your skills, you develop your skills, you find your niche. And the Karoo there was no one covering the Karoo at that stage. This huge, massive 40% of South Africa's land mass, 101 towns, villages, railway sidings. There was no one spending serious time here as a writer. A couple of photographic books had been done. That's about it. So we used Cradock, which is a great town for us strategically because it's a springboard to the Karoo. We used Cradock as our base and still do, and then travel widely, right up to the Richtersveld, across to places like Calvinia in the Northern Cape, just abutting the Western Cape coastline through the Nama Karoo, sometimes into Namibia, because that is also part of the Nama Karoo, and then across to the Kalahari. So yeah, it's managed to combine adventure with the possibility of earning a bit of a living.
But it's also a fascinating part of South Africa because it has so many different characters and so many different characteristics, doesn't it?
It does. This place, once you start rootling around the little towns and the farms of the Karoo, you come across layers and layers of stuff. I, for one, Jules and I, my wife Julie and I, she's also a journalist. We have different skill sets. I like the offbeat stuff. I like the travel. I like eccentric people. I like creatives. And the Karoo's full of them. People who've come to make a life for themselves here, a different life from what they may have had in the States. And we're seeing more and more of those people arriving, which is quite amazing. And Jules is into the cultural stuff, the environmental stuff, wildlife, and more topical stuff. So, for instance, when the fracking issue came about, Karoo possibility came about in 2011. She was on the case, and she made me drive to all these little dorpies where the gas industry was trying to convince the local community that, giving up their water in return for a job or two was a great thing. And so we were part of that whole, and I have to say it's an ongoing drive to try to keep people from looking with gas eyes at the Karoo. So that's the serious side. The lighter side, oh man, there's just the sense of humor in this part of the world is fantastic. Being able to just head out into the horizon, drive long distances. Not so long these days because of the price of diesel, so I have to be strategic. That's part of being freelance. And yeah, it's, as I say, it's a joy to work here.
Yeah, I've always wanted to, talking about local areas. I've always wanted to, but just because of time, I think I've never got around to doing it. Traveling around the country, and you go to the little dorpies like Springbok and Ukip and those sort of places, and you walk into a pub and you start talking to the locals and you start getting the stories out of the locals. There are some magnificent stories. Some of them, I guess, are folklore. Some of them are sheer bullshit. But they're just, they're just good stories. And they need to be told. They need to be documented, because otherwise we're going to lose that part of our culture.
I know, and this is the joy of doing this stuff, because whatever the headlines of today are, they will be forgotten in a week. But as you say, these funny little stories, if you can just track them, which we're trying to do desperately in our current book series, if you can just catch them in amber, as I say, and just put them down. And yes, the biggest stories are often from what might look to an outsider as the smallest characters. I mean, I can give you a million examples. The Calvinia's chief traffic, also the rock and roll Elvis type of Namaqualand, who can hold an audience of 80,000 in his hands and then write you a pink ticket the next day. It's characters like this. There's folklore, and yes, a fair amount of bullshit. Because one thing you've got to appreciate is that there's a certain art to conversation out here in the Karoo. People literally stoop sit. They sit on their stoops and they talk to each other. They don't sit and knock away at a digital device. They just have these long, lingering conversations. And often in an Afrikaans that I wasn't aware of before. Specifically, now I'm thinking you mentioned Oak Springbok going up to Port Nolloth, with the diamond divers there. Boy, can those guys drink. And just listening to the people talk, listening to the legends, listening to a little bit of what is a true myth and what is somebody's creation on a Saturday afternoon. Doesn't matter. As we say, don't let the facts get in the way of a hell of a good myth.
Yeah, exactly. Now I'm feeling very embarrassed because I've traveled fairly extensively around Africa and the world, but one area that I haven't really got into and discovered and tried to discover is the Karoo. I don't know why, because my roots are there. I mean, I'm from the Bathurst, Grahamstown area, which is on the border of the Karoo. Some of my best friends are still sheep farmers in Queenstown and places like that. And there are some magnificent little towns. There are also there's some little villages as well, which unfortunately just have fallen into absolute disrepair. I was going down to Cape Town on Rovos Rail, and we stopped for a pit stop at De Aar. And I remember in the 80s, De Aar was the biggest switching station in South Africa, and it was a humming little metropolis. And I was so sad when we pulled in and I just saw the entire town it was derelict.
Yeah.
And those sort of areas are areas where unless we start documenting the history of not the history, but the culture of De Aar, that's going to disappear.
Well, it's fantastic that you now mentioned De Aar because, firstly, back in 1983, a photographer called Les Bush and I went down to De Aar, where we sat and did lengthy interviews with the train drivers, the steam train drivers who had retired to De Aar after their careers. And that stuff is just fabulously. And we also did a photo shoot on the train graveyard because they were phasing out steam at that stage. So all of that is captured in story form. It's gone now. The graveyard has all been cut up and sold for scrap. The people have long passed, but the stories remain. And interestingly enough, on De Aar is, things go through change. They go through cycles of change. De Aar existed primarily because it was a railway town. When the railways practically ceased to exist, De Aar folded to a large degree. But if you go to De Aar now, you'll see the potential for change in the form of a huge, huge complex of solar farms around the town. Now, at some stage, when we commit ourselves more to renewable energy, because a lot of sun in the Karoo, we don't really need to be using all the fuels that we are. At some stage, I believe in the future, De Aar is going to rise again, and it will rise on the back of a long and sustainable energy industry. So watch De Aar, because the companies that are there at some stage will have to invest in the town itself. So you, as a traveler through, might well see some change in De Aar in the years to come. And you're quite right about the small towns. A lot of them have turned slightly fraught to the eye passing through. They look more than slightly fraught. But then you go back to a town and you discover that, wow, the streets are clean. There's something happening here. The buildings are being painted. There's some activity. And then you'll find that there's a small group of incomers have arrived from, let's say, Joburg or somewhere else, urban environment. And they're making a change. And it is just amazing how individuals can make a change in a small community in the Karoo, because problems, situations, challenges are all bite-sized. And when you come up with a solution, it stands out. And that's our job, is to go around and find these positive stories and communicate them to the rest of the world, so that one can see there's humanity here and also a certain amount of change. And also, we find if you write about a project that works in one town and it gets publicized, then another town might adopt a form of that project and make it work. So there's a knock-on effect to positive reporting of this kind.
Chris, 3 things I've got to do in the Karoo.
3 things that you should that you should do in the Karoo. Well, I would visit the town, the village of New Bethesda, which is not very far away from your old neighborhood. By the way, just in terms of Bathurst, apparently the Pig and Whistle is doing very well these days.
Yes, it is.
So, which is good news. And I would definitely go to New Bethesda. I would explore the Little Karoo from the Cape Town side, because that again is a very nice route along Route 62. There are towns there that bear what I've just been saying, like Barrydale, Prince Albert, places like that. And I would also, as part of a trip to New Bethesda, visit some of the other towns in what we call the Karoo Heartland, which is the Eastern Cape Karoo, and in particular mention places like Graafrenet. Also very well kept. It's got its challenges, but the people there are up to those challenges. And 3 things. I would visit the Mountain Zebra National Park outside Karoo, which is a much underrated and quite lovely place. You don't come here to see the volume of animals that you would at the Kruger National Park, but you see animals in a mountain landscape, which is quite lovely. So there are 3 things, but there are a million things actually.
Chris, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you very much. If people are wanting to find out more about your published material, how can they go about doing that?
We have a website called Karoo Space, www.karoospace.co.za, and the bookshop is up, our print bookshop is up, and there's about 600 features on the Karoo that people can just cast their eyes about and make their minds up about where they'd like to go.
www.karoospaces.co.za.
Karoo Space.
Karoo Space.
It's Karoo Space. There we go.
Lovely. Chris, thank you very much for your time on Mansfield Today.
Thank you very much. Okay,
Chris Murray, journalist, the best, he's a publisher and a Karoo storyteller. So come on, mark a draai, daar by die Karoo. Mansfield Today, and we'll be back tomorrow once again with all of your favorites. Thank you for joining us. If you did enjoy that, hit the subscribe button. Until next time, bye-bye.